Welcome back, everyone, and allow me to welcome here in the studio Ambassador Mohammed Anis Salim, member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for coming in tonight. But if you'll allow me just to talk once again to Dr. Dia Al-Qusi, water resources expert, to tell us more about the tripartite meeting. Okay, I'm being told that we don't have Dr. Dia over the phone. I apologize for that. Okay, Ambassador Mohammed, let me start off by asking you about the outcomes. How did you see the outcomes of the recently concluded Riyadh talks?
They were expected. This is the Syrian opposition getting its act together, right, preparing itself for a lengthy process, a negotiating process. It's significant because so far there were problems with the Syrian opposition agreeing to a common platform, agreeing to representatives to the talks, clarifying their position on where they stand on the various issues. The issues that they will be facing once the talks begin are complex and very varied. They include the future constitutional formula for Syria. They include measures to restructure the security sector. They include ceasefire arrangements. There are a lot of details, and it will probably take a lot of time. So it is a positive step. It is not problem-free. It is still going to require some more work, but at least a diplomatic process is underway.
Right, but with so many factions, including even the armed factions, do you think that it's going to be easy to reach a unified vision over the outcomes or the peace process or the peace plan?
Not at all. It's going to be very difficult. There are going to be divisions. There are going to be people who will walk away from the platform, and it requires leadership. It will require a strong role by the various countries supporting the different factions. So there is.
Do you think one country, though, should take the lead? Do you think one country needs to play sort of the biggest role in trying to bring the parties together? Perhaps a country that is neutral towards all sides, maybe even Egypt, so to speak? Or do you think Egypt wants to remain neutral as to what's happening in Syria?
The way the Syrian situation has evolved over the last 5 years has led us to a situation which is very internationalized. There is a huge amount of international intervention. There is competition at various levels. The local level, the fragmentation of Syria internally and the multiplicity of groups, as you were saying. The regional level, where the different regional parties are seeing Syria as a test ground for their influence and the future of their strategies in the region, and internationally with the two big powers heavily involved and on different sides of this situation. So it is very complex, and it would be difficult for a country like Egypt to play this role because Egypt doesn't really have the resources for it, in the sense that it is not really seen globally as influencing the situation on the ground. And its positions actually are not very clear at the moment. The Egyptian position on Syria has, over the last 5 years, also been quite ambiguous. I would say that perhaps there is a concern in Egypt that the internal issues have priority, and this is not the right moment to play this role, particularly since Saudi Arabia is playing such an important role in this.
What about a body, the Arab League? Do you think it's time that the Arab League stepped up and sort of tried to solve one of the many crises facing the region?
So far, the performance of the Arab League has been a body that refers things to the United Nations rather than tackle it itself. It has had an experience with the Arab Observer Mission in Syria in 2011. It had its fingers burnt, and it since then has stayed very far away. I would have liked to see the Arab League at least prepare for the next phase, because the next phase, if there is a ceasefire, which is part of the Vienna agreement, if there is a ceasefire and an observer mission, then there should be a role for the Arab League, role for facing Daesh. But I don't see this happening. I don't see the dynamics of it happening. I see that it looks much more like a UN-led operation the way things are evolving.
Right, you mentioned the role played by Saudi Arabia. How do you view that?
Saudi Arabia has become a key player in the Middle East.
Right.
It has the resources to get involved on many fronts. If you look today at Saudi Arabia, you'll find that they are involved in leading the Yemen intervention.
Mm-hmm.
They are involved also in Syria, very clearly, and seen globally as being involved. They are involved in the situation in Lebanon. Less so in the case of Libya, but that means that Saudi is looking to play a regional role and seeing itself steering the region to a certain future. In this future, one of the problems or challenges is the fact that the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right.
So, they are on different sides again in Syria.
Mm.
So this makes the issues more complex.
Mm.
I think we may be seeing also some evolving policy in Saudi Arabia, where the Saudi Arabian policy towards different local factions in the region is changing.
Right. Obviously the main sticking point is the continuation of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in power. I understand most of the groups have decided that he should resign. What do you think of that? Do you think that's feasible? Because we've seen Bashar al-Assad himself saying or dismissing that completely.
The issue under discussion is that there will be a transitory phase in Syria, and there will be an authority that will play a role in this, in steering Syria during that phase. The Vienna Agreement talks of different milestones, roughly about 2 years, over 2 years between constitution and new elections. The question is, does the Syrian president disappear from the scene at the beginning of the process, or somewhere in the middle, or towards the end of the process? That's the debate. There are different arguments on both sides. The key argument now is that the confrontation with Daesh needs to be given a priority, and that the idea of holding the Syrian state together requires that the Syrian president carry on. Now, the question is then, what are the guarantees for him disappearing from the scene? How does that happen? Who replaces him? These are the issues that, of course, will be subject to negotiations.
Because again, you don't want history repeating itself. We've seen on many occasions where you topple the dictator and more chaos follows.
That's true to some extent. I would say that each story we've seen in the region has its own particularities.
Right.
Of course, some lessons are gleaned, but there is a very strong argument that Syria needs change, and if the resistance movements and the population doesn't see change, then they will not become part of the process and may obstruct the process.
Right.
So that's one argument. The other argument is, of course, that this is a decision for the Syrian people in the end, and that it should be left to them, and the outside parties should not be involved in it.
Right. See, when that is said, what mechanism are you going to be allowing the remaining Syrians inside the country, even the Syrians who are now refugees abroad, to have a say? Are you going to hold elections? How can you guarantee that they're free and fair, etc.? What is the mechanism of allowing the Syrian people to have their say as to whether or not Bashar al-Assad stays?
The Vienna communique talks about United Nations supervision of the elections, and it talks of the participation of Syrians inside Syria and in the diaspora. Of course, again, it's not a hermetically sealed guarantee, but it is a step. Again, going back to your point on the League of Arab States, I would say that this is also an area where the League needs to get ready to be involved in this process.
Let's touch a little bit on Russia's role in this whole scenario. Now, obviously, Russia yesterday slammed the whole idea of the talk, saying that they didn't represent the whole or the entire swath of Syrian opposition. How do you see Moscow's responses towards what's happening in Syria and its involvement as a whole?
In terms of the opposition, Moscow was one of the parties that hosted meetings for the opposition. There was Moscow 1, Moscow 2 for the opposition, as indeed Cairo also hosted, and a number of other countries. So you could see that there will be some effort to influence the trend that is coming out of the opposition meeting. So, for example, the idea of demanding an early departure of the Syrian president, as opposed to leaving this ambiguous and allow it to be a subject for negotiations. Or perhaps whether the composition of the opposition groups would include some of the Islamic groups which Moscow feels very sensitive about. So I could see that the Russians would be interested in influencing the composition of the opposition groups that would come to the negotiating table, but also the platform that and I think this is happening on all sides. All of the parties that were there. Incidentally, many of these countries had representatives at least lobbying in the corridors during the meeting in Riyadh.
The media in particular always likes to show Russia as a key supporter of Bashar al-Assad, even sometimes accusing it of utilizing its airstrikes on Syria to actually bomb any fighters, not particularly targeting Daesh. Do you think that's necessarily the case, or do you think Russia isn't as supportive of Assad as it was 5 years ago?
On the formal side, the Russian position is that the decision on the next government in Syria should be left to the Syrian people. It's a very legalistic and correct position. On the pragmatic side, I would say the Russians are showing some open-mindedness on this, that they realize that there will be a need for change, but they are concerned that the Syrian state does not collapse during this process. Right. Now, Russia, in your earlier question, you're asking about the way Russia approaches this. Russia approaches this very much as a regional power, as opposed, because often we equate it with the United States, and they're not equivalent, because for Russia, it sees this as something that influences its direct national security. It's worried about the spillover from Syria into the Russian territory in neighboring states and the impact of that. So they're worried about that. They're worried about their own access and part of the world. So it's not as remote as the United States who look at it as a distance. You have a president of the United States that is coming to the end of his term. It's an election year. We know that it's not a good year for big decisions. So there are different dynamics. So I would say that this vision guides the Russian position. But I would say people should not discount the amount of flexibility that exists in the Russian position.
Right. Well, let me also ask you, now that we know that President Bashar al-Assad is rejecting these negotiations and rejecting himself negotiating with opposition groups which he dubs as terrorists, do you think that the January talks are going to be held at all?
There are, in Vienna there was an agreement on two mechanisms.
Right.
One mechanism was to bring the Syrian groups, the opposition groups together. Another mechanism, which was delegated to Jordan, is to list the terrorist groups that which would be listed on the UN list of terrorist groups and will not be involved in it. So that Jordanian-led process is still underway. And I would expect that the Russians would feed into that process and would have a say. Both the US, Russia, some other countries have presented lists of what they consider to be terrorist organizations. And of course, when you present a list like that, you also present a reasoning behind it. You present certain cases, you present certain names, and so on. So I would say that that process is ongoing. I would say that when you look at these 100 people who are in Riyadh, there is a possibility that the Russians may have concerns about some of them, but probably not all of them. This group has not designated yet the negotiating team,
Right.
so that still has to be done, I understand, at the end of this week. So there is still some more steps that will be taken.
Okay, and I thank you very much for your time and for coming in tonight. Ambassador Mohammed Anis Salem, member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, a quick break, and then we'll be coming back to discuss our second topic of discussion, and that is the Libyan peace talks that could witness the signing of a peace deal that includes parliamentary rivals. Let's take a look at the following report, and then I'll be back with my guest. Thank you very much.